Okay, so today is Martin Luther King Day, the day where we honor the man who may be the greatest hero America has ever produced, Martin Luther King. Now, MLK is a hero so beloved and so treasured that both Republicans and Democrats try to claim his legacy. But the truth is, Martin Luther King was a staunch liberal who voted Democrat, supported wealth redistribution, opposed war, and even vocally endorsed compensatory programs for black people that would include affirmative action. Let's take a look at what King had to say regarding politics. Martin Luther King avoided publicly endorsing political candidates, but through letters and books written by King, we know who he voted for in every presidential election in his lifetime, with the exception of 1956, which remains unknown. In 1956, MLK wrote a letter to a woman named Viva O. Sloan, in which he stated that he was unsure who he was going to vote for that year, but in the past, I've always voted the Democratic ticket. King made it clear in Chapter 5 of his book, Why We Can't Wait, that he voted for Kennedy, and that the issue during that election was not who to vote for, but whether or not to publicly endorse Kennedy. King writes that eventually he came to the conclusion that a public endorsement would be too much because no president except perhaps Lincoln had ever sufficiently given that degree of support to our struggle for freedom, but that, had President Kennedy lived, I would have probably endorsed him in the forthcoming election. The only other presidential election that King lived to vote in was the election of 1964, which was Democrat Lyndon Johnson, the man who signed the Civil Rights Act, versus Republican Barry Goldwater, the leading senator against the Civil Rights Act outside the South. Of the Republican Party, King stated in his annual report that, in San Francisco, the Republican Party took a giant stride away from its Lincoln tradition, gearing its appeal and program to racism, reaction, and extremism. All people of goodwill viewed with alarm and concern the frenzied wedding at the Cow Palace of the KKK with the radical right. King wrote that Republican nominee Goldwater represents an unrealistic conservatism that is totally out of touch with the realities of the 20th century and articulates a philosophy which gives aid and comfort to the races. I have no alternative but to urge every Negro and white person of goodwill to vote against Mr. Goldwater and to withdraw support from any Republican candidate that does not publicly disassociate himself from Senator Goldwater and his philosophy. On the other hand, King had mostly nice things to say about Democrat Lyndon Johnson. In Chapter 4 of Why We Can't Wait, King said that Johnson represented the new white elements of the South whose love of their land was stronger than the grip of old habits and customs. So, there you have it. We know who King voted for in every election except 1956. In a 1952 letter to his wife, Martin Luther King wrote, I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic. Capitalism, started out with a noble and high motive, but like most human systems, it fell victim to the very thing it was revolting against. So today, capitalism has outlived its usefulness. Do those sound like the words of a Republican or a Democrat to you? King also frequently stressed that America needed a redistribution of wealth with statements such as, call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all God's children. He also frequently advocated other liberal economic policies such as a higher minimum wage, job training, government spending on social welfare programs, guaranteed income, and public sector jobs for those who can't find jobs in the free market. It should also be noted that King's March on Washington called for a minimum wage that would be $15.27 in today's money. Martin Luther King made it clear in Why We Can't Wait that equality under the law alone was not enough and that compensatory treatment, which would include affirmative action, is necessary in order to have true equality among the races. He likened it to a foot race where one sprinter, symbolic for the white race, gets to start 300 years before the other race, and also pointed out, a society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for the Negro. When asked in a Playboy interview whether he supported a program of preferential treatment for black people and other minorities, King replied, I do indeed, stating that if veterans should be able to receive special treatment, the minorities should too. On top of that, King and the SCLC launched a campaign known as Operation Breadbasket, which is often viewed as the first affirmative action campaign. Martin Luther King was well known for his advocacy of nonviolence. He made his opposition to the war in Vietnam well known and frequently expressed his frustration with the fact that America spent more on the war than on social welfare, calling it a spiritual death. He was not afraid to invoke emotion into his speeches against the war, and in his speech, Why I Am Opposed to the War in Vietnam, he referred to the violence toward little brown Vietnamese children. something that today would earn him the label of bleeding heart liberal. With King opposing the senseless slaughter of those in Vietnam, one can only assume that he would also oppose the barbarism that America has committed in Iraq. So anyway, that's all for now. Like, comment, share, subscribe, all that stuff, and happy Martin Luther King Day.